Welcome back to your favorite space for reflection and wonder, the subconscious classroom, your quiet sanctuary after sundown. We're honored to have your presence again this evening. Tonight's 7-part journey unfolds not along roads or rivers, but along the delicate, deceptive lines of history's most dangerous maps. So you are no longer here in the now. You are drifting through ink-stained parchment and cracked globes, sailing toward islands that never were, and tracing borders that bled without cause. You are in the mind of the cartographer and the fate of those who believed him. Let us unfold the map. Let us begin. Part 1: The Power of Drawing Wrong Lines. Maps lie. They always have. They are elegant betrayals. Confident lines drawn through uncertainty, speculation inked as truth. For most of human history, to follow a map was not to follow reality, but to follow someone else's imagination, fear, or ambition. And sometimes, that imagination got people killed. This is not just a story of sailors lost at sea. It's about how entire empires trusted false shapes. How kings sent armies to places that didn't exist. How maps shaped dreams and doomed expeditions. And how, strangely, people kept believing in the power of paper long after it led them into deserts, into wars, or into the mouths of ice. Before we had satellites or even compasses, we had maps. And those maps were sometimes made by people who had never left their village. Take the Hereford Mappa Mundi, a 13th century English map that attempts to lay out the known world. It's not measured, it's not grid. Jerusalem sits at the center like the sun in a theological solar system. The British Isles look like a flattened dumpling off to the side. Dragons and headless men with faces in their chests stalk the borders of the map. Not because people believed they were metaphor, but because someone truly thought they were there. This was the age when belief shaped geography more than observation. Eden had a location. Hell sometimes did too. But even these monstrous imaginings were relatively harmless. The real danger came later, when maps started pretending they were scientific. By the age of exploration, maps were no longer decorative. They became instructions, and the stakes rose dramatically. In the late 1400s, a generation of European navigators launched into the unknown with fragile wooden ships, praying not just for wind, but for certainty. What they had instead were guesses, maps built on rumors, sailors' tales, and the occasional deliberate lie. The Portuguese, for instance, often circulated intentionally incorrect maps. These were state secrets, and the deception was strategic. If Spain got their hands on a Portuguese map, they'd find fake capes and phantom bays meant to throw them off. This wasn't an accident. It was cartographic espionage. When your empire depends on sea routes, misdirection becomes as valuable as a navy. One of the most infamous cases, the island of California. For more than a century, European maps depicted California as a long, narrow island off the coast of North America. Not a peninsula, an island. That single cartographic error persisted for decades, appearing in Spanish, French, Dutch, and English maps. Some explorers went looking for the sea that separated island California from the mainland. Others gave up, convinced it had disappeared. Why did the mistake last so long? Because it kept getting copied. Once a few respected mapmakers included it, no one wanted to be the one to say the emperor had no archipelago. And then there's the deadly case of phantom islands. Sailors returning from treacherous voyages often misidentified clouds, icebergs, or flocks of birds as land. In their logs, they'd note the coordinates and sometimes even give the mirage a name. Later, mapmakers would include these ghost islands, not wanting to risk omitting something real. Thus, maps became populated with places that didn't exist. Hy Brasil, Frisland, Thule, Peep's Island. Some of these imaginary lands made it onto charts for centuries. Peep's Island, for instance, appeared on British maps into the 19th century, and multiple expeditions were launched to find it. Every one of them failed. When ships sank in search of these illusions, the maps didn't change. The people were simply considered unlucky. But false maps didn't just lead individuals astray. Sometimes they sparked war. Consider the War of Jenkins' Ear, a strange conflict between Britain and Spain in the 18th century. Though sparked by a severed ear and years of maritime tension, the war was exacerbated by wildly different maps. British cartographers showed Florida and Georgia as being up for grabs. Spanish maps did not. So when the British moved into what they thought was empty land, Spain responded militarily. When two nations believe two different maps, blood follows. And sometimes the maps weren't merely wrong, they were fictional on purpose. A particularly sneaky tactic in the 20th century was the trap street, a fake street inserted into a map to catch copyright theft. If another company copied your map and included your fake road, you had legal proof of plagiarism. These were harmless enough until digital navigation systems started routing people down imaginary paths. The same trick was used with fake towns. In 2008, a town called Agloe, New York, existed only on paper. It was invented in the 1930s by mapmakers who wanted to detect if competitors stole their data. But then something strange happened. A gas station was built where Agloe was marked on the map. And the town, once fictional, became real because someone believed the map. This story has a strange moral. Sometimes, maps shape reality more than reality shapes maps. But maps haven't just misled, they've erased. Colonial powers redrew Africa in the 19th century with bold, straight lines. These borders were often drawn in European offices by men who had never set foot on the continent. They ignored tribes, languages, mountains, rivers, dividing land like cake at a party they weren't invited to. The result was long-lasting conflict. Artificial borders forced enemies to live within the same states and cut communities in half. The cartographic decisions made in London and Berlin still ripple through African politics today. In this case, the maps didn't kill directly, but the borders they imposed ignited wars, coups, and civil strife. Perhaps the most haunting example of cartographic death, the map of Hiroshima. Before dropping the atomic bomb in 1945, U.S. military planners selected Hiroshima in part because it had not yet been bombed, and thus, the impact would be clean for scientific analysis. A perfectly intact urban map was used to plan maximum devastation. Streets were not studied for survival, but for vaporization. It's a chilling reminder. Maps don't care if they are used for exploration or annihilation. They are tools, and tools reflect the hand that holds them. Why then do we trust them so much? Because maps promise control. They suggest that the world can be known, that everything has a name, a shape, a boundary, that if we just follow the lines, we'll arrive. But the truth is more dangerous. Maps are stories, some true, some false, many unfinished. They are filled with the biases, ambitions, and blind spots of their makers. And while most of us don't sail stormy seas anymore, we still follow invisible lines every day. Through borders, through laws, through zoning codes that tell us where we can live and where we can't. Every map is a ghost story, and some ghosts never leave the page. Part 2, Ghost Islands and the Lie of Discovery. If you open a 16th century sea chart and scan the waters west of Ireland, you'll likely spot something strange. A small island, round and green, sitting alone in the Atlantic like a coin dropped on a blue table. Its name is Hy Brasil, and it is a place that never existed. But for over 500 years, Hy Brasil appeared on maps. It wasn't drawn in foggy ink or labeled rumored. No, it was right there, solid, obvious, between Ireland and North America. And this wasn't an isolated incident. Dozens of such ghost islands haunted maritime charts. Frisland, St. Brendan's Island, Thule, Antilia, Zeno, Satanas, and more. Some, like Hy Brasil, were said to shimmer in and out of sight, only appearing once every 7 years. Others, like Frisland, were charted with full coastlines and named settlements. People didn't just believe in these places, they set out to find them. Why? Because maps have power, and people are drawn to the blank spaces. In a time when the horizon was a mystery, islands were more than land. They were hope. They were proof that the world was bigger than anyone imagined, that riches, salvation, or adventure might lie just over the waves. And in the competitive age of colonialism, being the first to discover one could mean fortune, glory, or even divine favor. So even when an island didn't exist, the promise of it was often enough. One of the most persistent ghost islands was Frisland, supposedly located between Greenland and Iceland. It first appeared on maps in the mid-1500s, complete with a detailed coastline and numerous cities. For over 100 years, it was copied faithfully by respected cartographers across Europe. The trouble was, nobody who sailed those waters ever found it. Some captains swore they saw it on foggy mornings. Others thought it had sunk beneath the sea. But the real explanation is simpler and more human. Once a lie enters a map, it's hard to erase, especially when it looks official. Cartographers often copied each other's work. If a prestigious mapmaker included an island, lesser-known ones would reproduce it out of caution. Removing it might imply that you were questioning your betters, or worse, that you knew less than they did. So ghost islands became self-perpetuating myths, repeated across oceans and generations. Even Captain Cook, one of history's most careful explorers, went looking for Davis Land, an imaginary strip of coast said to lie west of South America. He didn't find it, of course, but the fact that such a seasoned navigator still considered it possible speaks volumes. Then there's Sandy Island, a cartographic ghost that lived long past the age of sail. As recently as 2012, this island appeared on Google Maps, nestled in the Coral Sea between Australia and New Caledonia. Multiple atlases and digital charts showed it labeled clearly. The only problem? It wasn't there. An Australian research team sailed through the coordinates and found nothing but open water. No sandbar, no rocks, not even a shadow on the seafloor. How did this happen? Probably a single error, maybe a typo or a misidentified radar return, was copied and recopied over decades, solidifying a digital phantom that fooled even satellites. It was removed shortly after, but for years Sandy Island had existed in official navigation systems, weather reports, and academic papers. An entire fiction had crept into modern geography, undetected. It's easy to laugh at this, but it reveals something deeper. We still trust the map more than our eyes. Ghost islands were not always innocent. Sometimes they were weapons. In the 19th century, mapmakers began to realize that adding a non-existent feature could be a strategic tool. If your map contained a small, invented island, say Lusitania Rock, you could catch a rival cartographer who copied your work without attribution. This form of copyright trap became increasingly common. But in a world where ships relied on those maps for navigation, these traps could become dangerous. A crew might set sail expecting a safe harbor or use an invented landmass as a reference point, only to find themselves drifting off course in a featureless ocean. For all their beauty, maps began to inherit the same fallibility and the same politics as the people who made them. Phantom lands weren't limited to oceans. Some maps featured entire continents that never existed. One of the most famous examples is Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. For centuries, European maps showed an enormous continent at the bottom of the globe, stretching like a frozen counterweight to the land-heavy northern hemisphere. This continent was based on philosophical symmetry, not observation. If there was so much land up top, surely there must be equal mass below to balance it. So it was drawn. Some explorers believed they had touched its edge. Coastlines in South America, New Guinea, and even Australia were sometimes folded into this imagined southern world. It took well into the 18th century before cartographers began to abandon it, and by then, expeditions had been launched on false premises, fortunes had been spent, and lives had been lost chasing something that existed only on paper. This wasn't just scientific error, it was psychological. People wanted the world to make sense. They wanted symmetry, and they trusted the map to confirm it. But what happens when the map doesn't just reflect fantasy? It imposes it. That's what happened in the case of Antillia, an island said to lie west of Portugal, populated by 7 Christian bishops who fled the Muslim conquest of Iberia. The story had religious weight. It promised a sanctuary, a counter-Islamic outpost in the West. And for generations, Antillia appeared confidently on maps, even as sailors failed to find it. The idea of Antillia helped justify voyages into the Atlantic. Even though it wasn't real, it shaped real behavior. Colonizers, missionaries, and monarchs used it as a reason to send ships westward, fueling the myth of noble exploration. In this way, the lie of discovery became a guiding star. What's eerie is how these ghosts continue to haunt us. Even today, mapping errors creep into GPS systems, causing deliveries to go astray, hikers to get lost, and autonomous vehicles to panic. Entire neighborhoods have fought with digital map providers to remove fake roads or incorrect boundaries. But the stakes are more than minor annoyances. Borders drawn decades or centuries ago continue to cause conflict. Regions like Kashmir, Palestine, and Western Sahara remain flashpoints in part because maps disagree. What is a country? What is a state? If a border exists on paper, but not in reality, which is correct? And just like the explorers of old, governments, companies, and citizens still follow the line. There's a quiet kind of tragedy in these phantom lands. They remind us that exploration wasn't always about discovery. It was often about confirmation, about finding what we expected, even if it wasn't there. And when that expectation was wrong, it didn't just lead to missteps. It led to death. People died for places that didn't exist, for bays that were clouds, for continents that were dreams. And those dreams still linger in the corners of the map, whispering promises to the next set of believers. In the next part, we'll dive into how maps didn't just mislead explorers. They created false worlds from the ground up. cities that never existed, borders that sparked revolts, and how paper lines became etched into human lives. Part 3: Ghost Islands, Mythical Lands, and Mapmaker Folklore. There is a peculiar silence that hangs over an empty sea when land is expected and never arrives. That silence once echoed across decks and between men as their ships drifted in circles, anchored to belief rather than bedrock. Because for centuries, people sailed not toward land, but toward ideas. Names scribbled onto maps by men who had never set foot on the oceans, or worse, who had. Ghost islands were not mistakes. They were intentions. They were warnings. They were marketing. They were secrets, and sometimes they were wishes. Start with the island of Thule, a name plucked from Greek antiquity and kept alive by medieval monks who thought it might lie at the edge of the world. For some, Thule became Iceland. For others, it was just out of reach, a place so cold, so remote, so beyond, that even death might freeze trying to find you there. It appeared on maps for centuries, drifting north, then east, then gone. But not before it shaped imagination. Not before it was cited in manifestos and exploration grants as a real destination worth finding or claiming. Then came the island of Friesland. No, not Iceland, not Greenland, Friesland. It began appearing in the mid-1500s, showing up on multiple respected charts, including the famed Zeno map. Sailors looked for it west of the British Isles and found nothing. But the map didn't go away, and so captains plotted courses toward an island that did not exist, again and again. Some claimed to have seen it shrouded in fog. Others thought it must have sunk. Still others accused mapmakers of fraud. But the most chilling theory was this: that someone had added Friesland deliberately as a way to trick competitors into wasting time. And then there's the lost island of High Brazil. It hovered off the coast of Ireland, cloaked in legend and mist, promising golden domes and endless wisdom to those lucky, or doomed enough to find it. Mariners swore it was real. English cartographers gave it latitude and longitude. Even as late as the 1800s, sailors searched for it. But Brazil was always just one tide away, vanishing the moment a ship got too close. These weren't the only phantoms at sea. The 17th and 18th centuries brought dozens of ghost islands: Saxonburg, Doherty, Pepys Island, each claimed by an explorer or scribbled into a ship's log. Each then copied and copied again onto atlases that were sold, traded, and revered. The problem wasn't just that people believed them. The problem was that entire strategies, trades, and colonization efforts were built around them. When Spain plotted its defense of the Pacific coast, it accounted for islands that didn't exist. When Britain sought faster trade routes, it searched for lands that couldn't be found. Ships sent to reinforce non-existent territories simply never returned. But there's another layer beneath these cartographic myths. Many of these ghost islands were seeded into maps by intent, cartographers trying to protect their work. These copyright traps were known as mountweasels. False entries added so that if someone else copied your map, you could prove it. Sometimes it was a road that looped into nowhere. Sometimes a fake town with a plausible name. But in the ocean, an island did nicely, and it worked too well. Other cartographers copied the fake islands, either out of laziness or faith. Soon, the fakes became facts. Truth calcified into tradition, and the sea, once unmarked, was now full of lies. This is where myth and map begin to blur. Early map makers were not just scientists. They were storytellers, priests, politicians, and salesmen. They drew what they were told to draw or what they needed others to believe. And sometimes that meant monsters, Scattered across the northern seas of medieval maps, you'll find grotesque creatures. Fish with dragon heads, whales the size of cities, sea serpents twisting through waves. Were these genuine attempts at documentation? Maybe, but more often they were warnings, markers of danger, a visual way of saying, "Do not go here." When literacy was rare, pictures did the work of prose, and no one needed convincing to avoid a sea full of krakens. Yet even monsters had motives. Sailors sometimes invented them to explain failure, why they turned back, why the cargo was lost, why the crew went mad. And so the beasts remained, lurking in the margins, giving weight to rumors and dread to empty spaces. One of the most infamous examples is the 16th century Carta Marina, a Nordic map littered with creatures. One shows a ship being capsized by a massive fish. Another, a lion-faced sea beast biting through a hull. The mapmaker, Olaus Magnus, wasn't making it up entirely. He was compiling local beliefs, sailor testimonies, and folklore, then blending them into geography. Because what is a map, after all, if not a reflection of fear? Some maps were shaped not by what people found, but by what they didn't understand. The Strait of Anian, for example, was once believed to be a shortcut through North America. It existed only on maps, and it lasted for centuries because the idea of it was too convenient to abandon. In many cases, maps created a kind of reality. Once a thing was drawn, it became something to explain. Explorers began looking for what was already on the paper, and if they didn't find it, they questioned themselves, not the ink. The 18th century French cartographer Philippe Boich divided the Arctic into a system of rivers and seas based on theoretical data. He had no physical evidence, but his maps influenced polar expeditions for decades. When you believe a place is passable, you bring different tools. You make different decisions. You live or die according to the drawing. Perhaps no one understood this better than governments. When colonial powers began carving up Africa, maps were redrawn from thousands of miles away. Arbitrary lines were drawn through ethnic groups, water sources, trade paths. Sometimes the lines were meant to confuse, to delay, to distract, to divide. And they still echo today. Even in the 20th century, ghost borders persisted. Take the case of the Kerguelen Islands, remote landmasses in the southern Indian Ocean. Discovered, forgotten, rediscovered, claimed, and finally mapped by the French. For years, various atlases gave conflicting coordinates. Some maps showed ports where there were only cliffs. Others missed whole bays. Researchers suspect the errors were both honest and strategic, designed to discourage rivals from interest. And then there were ghost airports. In the Cold War, several nations constructed airstrips on maps that never existed on the ground or disguised real ones beneath fake names. This wasn't just artistic license. This was survival. Maps became battlegrounds. If your enemy thought there was a base where there wasn't or failed to notice the one that did exist, that confusion could buy you time or cost them lives. Cartography by then had become a weapon. And like all weapons, it could be turned inward. Governments began printing distorted maps for their own populations. Educational atlases emphasized friendly nations, minimized enemies, or moved borders subtly to reflect political aims. In some cases, maps were required by law to show a version of the world that only existed in the minds of bureaucrats. The distance between map and reality widened. We tend to think of maps as neutral, but no map is neutral. Every choice, what to include, what to omit, how to label, shapes perception. And perception, in turn, shapes decisions. Sometimes those decisions were fatal. Sailors drowning in search of invisible islands. Soldiers deployed to territories that weren't real. nations fractured by borders that were never meant to be understood. Even today, GPS systems occasionally direct drivers into rivers or deserts. The lie persists not on parchment, but in pixels. And yet we keep believing, because a map tells us where we are. It reassures. It gives the illusion of control in a chaotic world. But behind every line is a hand, and behind every hand is a motive. Some just want to show the way. Others want you to get lost. Part 4: Borders that bled for centuries. The difference between a country and a conflict is sometimes a single line. For most of human history, borders were not carefully surveyed, digitized, and plotted on maps. They were rumors, customs, rivers, and fences, flexible and fragile. But as cartography matured into a weapon of politics, the lines got sharper. And with them, so did the stakes. Let's begin in the 17th century, where the idea of a border as a defined legal concept truly began to solidify in Europe. Before this, territories often had zones of influence rather than exact boundaries. But as monarchs became administrators and empires turned to paper, something changed. Now, a border was not just where your patrols ended. It was where your map said they ended, even if the land didn't agree. This shift gave birth to what scholars call cartographic aggression. A simple concept. If you draw the border on a map before your neighbor does, it might as well be yours. No boots, no battles, just ink. But those lines often led to blood. One of the most famous examples comes from a now quiet stretch of woodland between what we call today Belgium and the Netherlands. In the 1840s, Dutch cartographers claimed a forested region based on outdated Napoleonic surveys. Belgian officials countered with their own maps, traced from older Habsburg documents. Neither side wanted war, but both had maps saying they were right. Troops stood across from one another for years, rifles shouldered, over what was essentially a paper disagreement. The conflict didn't officially resolve until the 1990s, when someone realized that the trees in question had been cut down decades earlier. Borders have also bled along rivers, but rivers move. Take the Rio Grande in the United States. It marks the southern boundary between Texas and Mexico, but the river doesn't stay put. After major floods, it's been known to shift dramatically, abandoning its old channel and carving a new one miles away. In 1864, one such shift stranded a patch of Mexican farmland, now seemingly on U.S. soil. Both nations claimed it. Maps diverged. Soldiers arrived. The Chamizal dispute would drag on for a century, and the land would not officially be handed back to Mexico until 1963. It's one thing to argue over lines. It's another when even nature won't obey them. But nowhere is the madness of mapped borders more tragic than in Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 was not a war, but it may as well have been. European powers, eager to divide the African continent for themselves, convened with rulers, pens, and arrogance. They drew straight lines through deserts, jungles, and ancestral homes, splitting cultures, bisecting languages, and forging entirely new nations in rooms that smelled of brandy and colonial ambition. The Durand Line, for example, separating modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, was the product of British strategic paranoia. Its drafter, Mortimer Durand, consulted no tribal elders and ignored ancient migration paths. Today, that line is still a source of bitter resentment. It cuts through Pashtun territory, splitting communities that had lived together for centuries. It's been called one of the most dangerous borders in the world, not because it was fought over, but because it was never accepted. And then, there are phantom borders, boundaries that exist only on maps, but still cause real consequences. After World War I, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire gave rise to a dizzying array of new borders in the Middle East. The British and French, eager to secure oil fields and influence, drew their claims in secret. The most infamous of these was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a clandestine 1916 map that divided Arab lands into British and French zones. The agreement ignored promises made to local leaders and disregarded centuries of history. When the map was leaked, outrage exploded. Entire regions revolted, not over what was happening on the ground, but over what had been drawn in London and Paris behind closed doors. In India, the Radcliffe Line offers perhaps the most chilling example of borders birthing violence. When British India was partitioned in 1947 into India and Pakistan, lawyer Cyril Radcliffe was tasked with drawing the border. He had never been to India. He had 5 weeks to do it, armed with maps, census reports, and no knowledge of culture or terrain. He sketched a line that would displace over 14 million people. Hindus and Sikhs fled west, Muslims fled east. Entire trains arrived full of corpses. It was not war in the traditional sense, but more people died during partition than in many declared wars. Radcliffe later refused his fee. He said he couldn't live with what his map had caused. Some borders are born not from politics, but from error. In the 1800s, a surveyor in North America misread the angle of the Mississippi River's flow and placed the Toledo Strip, a thin stretch of land, within Michigan instead of Ohio. Both states mobilized militias. Shots were fired. One man was stabbed. The Toledo War ended with Congress stepping in and giving Michigan the Upper Peninsula as compensation. To this day, Michiganders quietly celebrate winning that exchange. There's a term geographers sometimes use, map trap. It refers to the dangerous tendency to believe whatever a map says, no matter how absurd. Once a border is printed, it's hard to erase, even if it's wrong. People fight for them, die for them, name their children after them. And that brings us to the Cold War. At the height of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, entire swaths of Europe were blanketed in secrecy. Maps from the West omitted Soviet infrastructure. Soviet maps, in turn, shifted the location of key cities, factories, and landmarks to confuse potential invaders. A factory might be marked 5 miles from its true position. A rail line might vanish entirely. In some places, multiple maps existed for the same region, each with its own version of truth. This didn't just confuse spies, confused locals. Emergency services got lost. Deliveries vanished. Tourists drove in circles. The world was mapped in mirrors, designed not to reflect reality, but to distort it. And still today, the echo of cartographic harm continues. Disputes over the South China Sea hinge on lines drawn decades ago, some real, some imagined. In the Arctic, as melting ice reveals new shipping lanes, nations scramble to define boundaries no one thought would matter in their lifetimes. And every now and then, a village in Europe discovers that its name has been slightly misspelled on official maps for generations, and that fixing it might erase centuries of identity. Because here's the truth: maps are not reality. They are stories. They are power. And once they're printed, they rarely apologize. Part 5 will continue this journey into the deceptive and deadly world of maps, exploring the hidden political motives behind their design, the creation of propaganda through cartography, and the strange way we still trust the lines we see. Part 5: Propaganda, Power, and Cartographic Control. There's something almost sacred about a map. Even now, in an age of satellites and GPS, we look to them with a kind of reverence. They tell us where we are. They tell us who we are. And because of that, they have always been the perfect tool for control. Throughout history, cartography was never just about accuracy. It was about authority. Whoever held the pen held the world. Let's begin in the Age of Empires. When Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands were at the height of their naval power, maps became symbols of global conquest. But these weren't meant to guide sailors. They were meant to impress monarchs. The coastlines were embellished. Enemies were shrunk. Seas were filled with heroic galleons and sea monsters to make the unknown look conquered. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller published a map with a curious label, America. It was the first map to use that term in honor of explorer Amerigo Vespucci, even though Columbus had reached the Caribbean first. Why? Politics. Waldseemüller's patrons wanted to honor their own man, not Spain's. One name, one choice of font, and the world was changed forever. As the British Empire expanded, so did its mapping needs. The Ordnance Survey was founded in the late 1700s not to help hikers, but to help cannon crews. The British feared a French invasion, so they mapped every hill, valley, and farm lane across the United Kingdom. Military logic shaped civilian understanding of space. If you've ever wondered why British maps are so incredibly detailed, down to barn walls and hedgerows, it's because they were once blueprints for war. But propaganda didn't just come in what maps showed, came in what they left out. During the Cold War, American maps of the Soviet Union were deliberately vague. Vast areas were marked with featureless color swaths. No roads, no rivers, just a warning. Information not available. But it wasn't because we didn't know. It was because uncertainty itself was a weapon. If the public believed that the enemy's landscape was unknowable, it fueled fear. Meanwhile, the Soviets did the same, but stranger. Official Soviet maps often relocated sensitive sites, nuclear facilities, military outposts, even whole cities by miles in every direction. Entire places were given fake names. One city, home to tens of thousands of people, appeared on no map. Its real name? Chelyabinsk 40. Its purpose? Nuclear production. Its visibility? Non-existent. Even residents couldn't say where they lived in letters. On paper, they were shadows. But not all deception is state-sponsored. Sometimes it's just clever. Cartographers call it the trap street. To protect against copyright infringement, mapmakers would invent a fake street, cul-de-sac, or park and place it quietly within a real city. If a competitor's map copied that street, the fraud was obvious. This trick has existed for over 100 years, and some trap streets still appear on modern maps, even though the streets themselves never did. The same principle applies to paper towns. One of the most famous was Agloe, New York. It was invented by a map company in the 1930s, placed at a junction of two roads as a copyright trap. But then something strange happened. A general store opened at that intersection. Locals began referring to the place as Agloe. The map had created a town by accident. Fiction became real. Cartographic imagination had summoned a population. This reveals something deeper. Maps don't just reflect the world, they create it. Consider the famous Gall-Peters projection versus the Mercator projection. The Mercator map, developed in 1569, distorts the size of land masses near the poles, making Europe and North America look much larger than they are. Africa, by contrast, is drastically shrunk. This was convenient for colonial powers who wanted to see themselves as dominant, both politically and spatially. In the 20th century, the Gall-Peters projection attempted to fix this distortion, showing land masses in true proportion to their surface area. But it looked strange to Western eyes. Africa ballooned, Europe squashed. Teachers rejected it. The public didn't trust it. It didn't feel right. And that's the secret. A map's truth is only accepted if it confirms what people already believe. In classrooms across the globe, children have grown up staring at maps that whisper subtle lies. That north is always up, that Europe is the center of the world, that certain countries are large because they are important. Maps teach us where to look and what to ignore. This is why colonial maps often excluded indigenous names. Entire regions in North America, Australia, and Africa were stripped of traditional place names, replaced with names honoring generals, monarchs, and financiers. It wasn't just cultural erasure, it was spatial conquest. If you control the name, you control the story. In Nazi Germany, maps were used to justify genocide. In occupied Poland, maps were redrawn to erase Jewish neighborhoods. Entire districts were labeled as undesirable or cleared, even before the residents had been removed. Bureaucrats used color-coded charts to track progress, like an accountant balancing a ledger. When geography becomes data, cruelty feels like administration. Even today, maps are used to manipulate emotion. Election maps in the United States often use red and blue to show political divisions. But those colors cover entire states, implying unity, when the reality is far more nuanced. A state might be 51% one way and 49% the other, but on the map it glows a single color. No doubt.
No debate.
Just a flood of pigment. It's a kind of cartographic gaslighting. And then there's the map of Palestine, a shifting mosaic of erasure and reappearance. Depending on which map you look at, the territory either exists, doesn't exist, is divided, is annexed, is occupied, or is administratively unified. No two maps agree, and yet each one claims to tell the truth. This is not an accident. This is the point. To map a thing is to claim it. To erase a thing from a map is to destroy it without lifting a sword. Throughout history, entire peoples have vanished in this way, not by war, but by omission. Even today, there are countries whose borders are disputed: Taiwan, Western Sahara, Crimea. Depending on who prints the map, the lines shift, the facts bend. And while diplomats argue, cartographers quietly pick sides. Because maps don't just tell the story. They choose the story. In the next part, we'll explore the bizarre history of imaginary islands, geographic hoaxes and mistaken sightings that ended up in atlases for centuries. Islands that were chased, charted, and sometimes died when someone finally sailed out to find nothing. Part 6, the ghost islands that never were. There is something especially cruel about being lost at sea. Not because you don't know where you are, but because you think you do. For centuries, maps have been haunted by islands that never existed. Ghost islands, phantoms in the waves, places that once occupied the pages of atlases, only to vanish into cartographic oblivion when someone finally went looking and found water. One of the most notorious of these is Sandy Island. For over a century, it appeared on nautical charts near New Caledonia in the South Pacific. It was listed in shipping manuals, logged in mapping software, and even recorded by satellite. But in 2012, a group of Australian scientists sailed to the coordinates and found open ocean. No island.
No sand.
Just the ghost of a mistake. How did it happen? A likely explanation points to a 19th century whaling ship, which may have misidentified a pumice raft or volcanic debris as land. The coordinates were copied, the error passed down, and so Sandy Island was real for 140 years on paper. Then there's Hy Brasil, a legendary island said to lie west of Ireland. It appeared on maps from the 14th to the 19th centuries, often drawn as a perfect circle with a central strait. Sailors swore they saw it. Some even claimed to have landed, but it always vanished into mist. Eventually, it faded from charts, but not from folklore. Hy Brasil became shorthand for the unreachable, the not quite there, a symbol of how maps sometimes capture longing more than geography. Or take Antillia, also called the Island of Seven Cities. It first appeared on a 15th century chart as a refuge for bishops fleeing the Muslim conquest of Iberia. The myth claimed they built a utopia there, far from war. For a time, Antillia was thought to sit just west of the Azores, an in-between place part Holy Grail, part nationalistic fantasy. Portugal even issued charters to explore and claim it. Spoiler, they never found it. Some ghost islands were cartographic revenge. In the 1700s, Britain and France were locked in a colonial arms race. Rumors of rich islands in the Indian Ocean began circulating. British mapmakers, hoping to lure French explorers into wasting time and money, may have accidentally added Al Grande to maps. When the French arrived, they found open sea. The trap had worked. Others were the result of simple yet persistent error. The island of California is one of the most famous. Early Spanish explorers sailed along the Baja Peninsula and mistook it for an island. The error appeared on maps for centuries, even after overland expeditions proved California was connected to the mainland. It took until the mid-1700s for most European cartographers to correct it. Why did the error last so long? Because maps, once printed, resist change. They feel authoritative. Printed error becomes tradition, and no one wants to be the cartographer who dares contradict the map that came before. And then there's Friesland, a sizable phantom island off the southern coast of Greenland. It appeared on maps throughout the 1500s and 1600s, even though no one had ever landed on it. Some believe it was a misrepresentation of part of Iceland. Others suspect it was a pure fabrication. Regardless, it had coastlines, cities, and mountains, all completely invented. It was drawn with confidence, which made it real for a while. Cartographic ghost stories aren't limited to islands. Mountains of Kong. Anyone? For much of the 19th century, European maps of Africa showed a sprawling east-west mountain range just north of the equator, the Mountains of Kong. No such mountains exist, but they appeared on map after map, drawn by people who had never been within 500 miles of the continent. The mountains served a psychological function. They filled in the blank parts of the world. In a way, they were less about deception and more about discomfort with the unknown. Better to draw something than to leave the page empty. Ghost features could be dangerous. In 1943, during World War II, the US Navy shelled a Japanese-occupied island called Takeshima off the coast of Japan. It didn't exist. The shelling wasted ammunition and revealed American positions. The error came from outdated Japanese charts, copied by Allied forces without confirmation. Likewise, phantom reefs have claimed countless ships. Sailors, trusting their charts, would steer clear of dangers that weren't there, often sailing straight into real hazards that had been omitted. But sometimes the opposite was true. In the age of piracy, captains would invent hazards to protect secrets. A pirate who discovered a hidden cove might report it as a deadly reef, ensuring no rival approached. These strategic lies made their way into maps and lingered long after the last pirate was hanged. And there are modern echoes. In 2008, an amateur German cartographer noticed a small island, Null Island, sitting at 0 degrees latitude and 0 degrees longitude in digital map software. It wasn't real, of course. It was a placeholder, the default point for null GPS data. But software glitches had rendered it visible, and soon Null Island became a running joke among developers. A non-existent speck of land became the most precisely located fake island on Earth. But what does this all mean? It means that the act of mapping is never neutral. Even the mistakes are meaningful. Every ghost island tells us something, not just about navigational error, but about fear, hope, ambition, and myth. They are records not of terrain, but of belief. A sailor sees a shape in the mist. A cartographer copies the shape. A kingdom sends ships based on the copy. A life is lost because someone trusted a mirage. One ripple of ink, one curve of coastline too confidently drawn, and the world is changed. Today, we assume satellite maps are perfect. But even now, digital cartography hides things. Military installations, secret prisons, and strategic infrastructure are often blurred or misrepresented in satellite imagery. In that way, we are not so different from the explorers of old, chasing coastlines that exist only in our minds. In the final part of this journey, we'll explore how the future of maps, augmented reality, AI-generated geography, and digital terraforming could create new dangers as humanity continues to trust images of the world that may not be true. Part 7. When the future map is a lie. In the age of satellites, you might think the map has finally stopped lying. Every continent scanned, every street photographed, every coastline outlined by a network of orbiting precision. And yet, our maps are still haunted, not by phantoms of land or sea, but by errors of intention. The lie today isn't that the map is wrong by accident. It's that the map is right on purpose, but only for some people. Let's begin with what's hidden. Even now, satellite maps leave out entire swaths of terrain. Sometimes it's for military secrecy, airports blacked out, nuclear silos blurred into forests. But it's not just about hiding from enemies, it's about owning the narrative. In some countries, government buildings appear as low-resolution blobs, or worse, duplicated suburbs. A would-be attacker sees nothing useful, but so does everyone else. That's the catch. Map censorship isn't selective. It affects everyone equally. The modern map doesn't lie by showing what's false. It lies by withholding what's true. Then there's what's manufactured. In 2018, researchers uncovered neighborhoods in China's maps that didn't exist. Perfectly drawn city blocks, lush parks, intersections with no corresponding roads. They weren't accidents. They were map traps, designed to catch copyright thieves. If another company copied the map exactly, the false neighborhood would be proof. But what happens when those fake blocks get scraped into a global dataset? When they become part of your GPS, you arrive at an address that was born from a legal trick, a ghost house not on any street. In that way, the digital map becomes a hall of mirrors, a collection of half-truths and clever decoys. This brings us to the problem of algorithmic geography. Today's maps are no longer drawn by people walking the land. They're stitched together by AI from multiple sources: satellite, street view, user corrections, municipal data. The more data you feed in, the better the map gets. But who chooses what counts as accurate? Already, neighborhoods are mislabeled by algorithms trained on biased datasets. A low-income area might be tagged as unsafe by a route planning tool, not because it is, but because crime data was overreported. Travelers are rerouted. Property values dip. A map, once again, becomes a weapon not through malice but through momentum. It's not just cities. Entire nations are erased or altered depending on who is looking. Open a map of Kashmir in India, and you'll see borders that reflect Indian sovereignty. Open the same map in Pakistan and the lines shift. Google complies with each country's laws because if it didn't, it would be banned. What does this mean? It means the shape of the Earth itself now depends on your IP address. The same company, the same database, different truths. This is cartographic relativism, the death of the one true map. And now we arrive at augmented reality, where maps are not something you look at, but something you walk through. Picture this: you're in a city square wearing smart glasses. The building ahead is unlabeled. Your AR overlay, however, tells you it's a coffee shop. You follow the arrow. But what if it isn't? What if the map is sponsored? What if a competitor paid to reroute you? Or worse, what if the map was hacked? In 2020, researchers demonstrated a GPS spoofing attack in which a ship in the Black Sea was made to appear on land at an airport. It wasn't theory. It worked. The ship's own crew thought they were somewhere else. Planes have been tricked into adjusting course. Self-driving cars can be spoofed with magnets and decals. The map is manipulable. The cartographic future is fragile. And here's the final irony. We are now beginning to draw new worlds from scratch. Video game maps, virtual real estate, the metaverse. These aren't just toys. They are spaces with economic and cultural weight. People buy plots of land in a map that exists only in code. They attend concerts, hold meetings, fall in love. But even here, danger lurks. Who controls these maps? What happens when a virtual neighborhood is redrawn? When your plot is erased in an update? When the street you memorized is gone, and the city you knew has been patched into something else? It's not new. In 1784, a Prussian mapmaker miscopied a mountain pass, leading an entire army astray. In 1958, the US Air Force accidentally bombed Cambodia, misled by a cartographic mistake. In 2023, a hiker in Scotland was airlifted after following an online trail that didn't exist. It's always the same story. Someone trusted the line, the compass, the border, the promised island, and it didn't love them back. Maps are supposed to show us the world, but too often they show us ourselves, our fears, our ambitions, our blindnesses. A map can start a war, send a ship to its doom, deny a people their name. A line on a page can become a wall or a grave. So the next time you glance at a map, whether paper or pixel, remember, it was made by someone with an agenda, a perspective, purpose, and maybe, just maybe, a lie. Let your eyes rest now. Let the imagined lands settle like silt in a still sea. The ghosts of false islands, the crooked borders, the phantom reefs. They drift just out of reach, where paper meets dream. Until next time, fellow traveler, let us fold the map.